Excellent. Hi, everyone. See our everyone's just logging on now, so I'm going to give us a little bit of time to uh, to do that component. We do have a lot of content we want to try to cover today, and I want to try to leave most of our time for us to chat with Kerry here. So just give everyone a minute or two. About 2 minutes, I'll go ahead and get started. And Kerry, of course, if you want to take that time to get a glass of water or anything else, feel free.
I'm gonna go heat up my teapot. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Welcome, everybody. For those who are just joining, just giving everyone else a minute or two to hop on. Feel free to take a minute. I'll start us up at 10:03 my time. I'm on the Pacific Coast. Welcome, everyone. We do have a chat open. I'm going to use it later for a poll and for questions during our fireside chat. Please feel free to drop in where you're from, where you're calling in from. If you want to share your organization, that's also welcome. And then make sure you get your questions ready for later. Seeing a lot of other Californians from the East Coast originally. Kerry's joining us from the East Coast. Excellent. Welcome, folks. Just giving us one more minute until I see our participant numbers start to slow. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I know this is a hot topic and one everyone is really excited to talk about. Everyone in my personal life, everyone in my professional life, massively top of mind. Okay, great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's webinar, Navigating Climate Reversal's Corporate Sustainability Under the New Administration. I'm Corinne Hansen, Vice President of Sustainability at Green Places, and I'm thrilled to be here with our esteemed guest, Kerry Duggan, to discuss how businesses can continue to make progress on sustainability despite shifting policy landscapes. And I know that shifting policy landscapes are nothing new, but having been through this administration at least one time before, obviously, we know that this is a dramatic shift. And we, up until this point, the United States have not seen progress on climate change in the way that we'd like to, even with such forward-thinking individuals, really smart people who are capable of solving problems, and a really big, hulking, obvious problem. So I know that's why everyone's here to talk today. A lot has shifted in the past month, and today's discussion will cover the key policy shifts, how they're impacting business, and why corporate sustainability is more critical than ever, even in the face of policy rollbacks. So I think we're just a few slides ahead there, but I just want to pop us back, do a little bit of an intro. My name is Corinne Hansen. I'm the VP of Sustainability at Green Places. We help businesses track and manage their carbon footprints and provide decarbonization recommendations, help folks stay ahead of evolving regulations, everything sort of end-to-end, help figure out how to address your sustainability strategy using data and using software as sort of the focal point. I come from a policy background originally. I was in DC for many years. I most recently was running sustainability at SH Hotels and Resorts. And so I am particularly thrilled to have Kerry join us. Kerry is a sustainability expert, corporate board director, University of Michigan faculty member, and former climate advisor to President Joe Biden. She's also the founding and managing partner at Energy Security Partners, where she works with CEOs, executive teams, climate tech entrepreneurs to navigate the complexities of energy, climate policy, and security. Truly, the list goes on and on and on. If you're not already familiar with Kerry, please go take a look at her work or even just her bio. But I'm thrilled to have you on today, Kerry. Thank you so much for being here. It's truly an honor, and I think it's going to be a really good discussion. I feel excited based just on our prep alone. I think this is going to be a good chat. Um, so let me go over the agenda briefly now to make sure that we get enough time to get to that chat. Today, I do want to talk about the topic on everyone's minds, which has been what has been and what will be the Trump administration's impact on climate justice. What's changed, how sustainability as a field and a practice uh, to protect people and natural resources still matters in this context, and a discussion with the incomparable Kerry, which is really such a special privilege to have you here and have your insight on these topics. If you do have questions, please pop them in the chat, but I would hold till the end if you want us to share them with Kerry directly, but our team will kind of record them and share them with me as well. Before we dive in, I want to start with a quick poll, which is, will your organization be required to report carbon emissions publicly or to clients and or investors in the next year? So you should have seen just now a poll pop up. Yes, no, I don't know, all valid answers. I know a lot of folks are facing the California regulations this year. So please feel free to pop a response on there. Give folks a minute to do that. Public reporting in the United States on your carbon emissions is really kind of a nascent space. So I know we work with a lot of our clients navigating that. The tenets of carbon accounting are complicated, as we know, but really exciting to see about 67% of you, this is actually pretty in keeping with the data that we're finding with clients and partners as well, are subject to publicly report emissions or to clients or investors in the next year. Future poll, get down into the nit and grit, how much of that is going toward public, how much is going down to investors, et cetera. But thank you all for answering that. The reason I ask that is because we're going to talk now about the Trump administration's impact on climate justice. I am going to go through a number of things that feel negative in tone. There's a lot of rollbacks on climate work that I want to talk through just so we can level set, understand what's happening. But I wanted to have that poll in the front here because everyone is still required to report and disclose emissions, and everyone is still making progress on climate action. Sort of, how do we do that in the face of less support from federal administration here is really the name of the game. So I want to start with the resources that we do have available. We, of course, have a prior administration to look to, but if we're looking at examining the current landscape, in addition to looking at those patterns from this administration's first term, we can also look to the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. It outlines significant regulatory rollbacks across environmental, energy, and climate sectors, 900 pages of policy blueprint. It aims to dismantle climate policies, including withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, promoting fossil fuel development. And though Trump has made comments about whether or not he plans to enact a lot of the policies in here, what we can say is that over the past month, there's been a really rapid implementation of key policies from this document. So we definitely want to use it as a source to understand what might be coming. One of the most immediate changes is the rollback of climate-focused policies and a pause on clean energy funding from the Inflation Reduction Act. I'll probably use a lot of acronyms in this conversation, so IRA going forward. This move aligns with Project 2025's push for energy independence and deregulation, prioritizing expanded fossil fuel development and reducing federal involvement in renewable energy incentives. So drawing up on traditional fossil fuels and a drawdown on our commitment to renewables and their advancement of climate policy. We've also seen a really important freeze on federal hiring and a regulatory review mandate, which means that agencies are now delaying or rescinding key environmental regulations. So this could impact everything from emissions reporting requirements, which obviously touches our work really directly, to environmental impact assessments for new developments, the sort of foundation of this country's environmental policy, NEPA. So yeah, many big dramatic changes to our environmental landscape. Under the new policy direction, this is really critical because emissions are expected to rise significantly. And obviously we've had targets in place for many years now trying to draw down our emissions. According to recent studies, if Project 2025 policies are fully implemented, US carbon emissions could increase by 2.7 billion tons by 2030, which obviously is feeling just right around the corner for those of you who have targets that land in 2030. It's mostly due to the rollback of clean energy incentives, which were foundational of the IRA, and a push to expand oil and gas production. Um, so just to go into that in a little bit more detail, beyond emissions alone, there are corollary costs in valuation that we need to consider. The first is economic costs, so higher energy costs associated with these policies. Households may see as much as $32 billion in additional energy costs annually in the United States, coming from subsidies for renewables that are reduced and fossil fuel reliance increases. We know that those energy prices are quite volatile. Job losses, the policies could lead to the loss of 1.7 million jobs and about $320 billion in GDP per year, particularly in the clean energy and sustainability sectors, which were prospected to be major areas of job growth for this country. And environmental damage, of course, expanded drilling that would threaten critical habitats and ecosystems, foundational to a lot of what's been talked about so far, and really long-term consequences to biodiversity and water resources. So I want to talk a little bit more detail about what has actually changed versus the big trends here. So several executive orders, the main mechanism for delivery of these policies thus far, have been signed that do align with Project 2025. The freeze on the IRA funding, which halts grants and loans for clean energy projects. A rollback of the SEC climate disclosure rules. So we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a minute, but right now, we are a little bit behind a lot of the rest of the world in terms of climate disclosure regulation, and that's really the basis for how we're going to start to decarbonize is understanding where emissions are coming from corporations and holding them accountable. So this could delay or potentially eliminate requirements for publicly traded companies to report climate risks. I think it's reasonable that we expect that not to move forward in the next 4 years at least. And then cuts to EPA resources. So this impacts everything from emissions factor updates, which makes carbon accounting more difficult for businesses, and also things like provisioning EV tax credits, et cetera, anything that would sort of support that clean energy transition. So what does the pause on IRA funding really mean? The freeze does specifically target EV infrastructure and renewable energy grants, which leaves a lot of projects in limbo, things that were set to move forward and have received some investment already. Currently, tax credits for solar and wind technically remain, but new funding is uncertain, and those are markets that need long-term funding to make that infrastructure possible, and certainly makes it difficult for companies who want to participate in those markets to know how to do so. Legal challenges are already underway, and it's unclear if funding may be restored, but that's definitely one to watch, and I'm sure something that we'll talk about in a little bit. I did touch on the SEC climate disclosure rule. It was passed in 2024 for those of you who are still kind of catching up. It did require publicly traded companies to disclose climate-related risks. There's a challenge, a rollback, voluntary to just disclose scope 1 and 2 emissions. But the new administration has paused its enforcement and definitely has signaled plans to weaken or eliminate it altogether. All of this aligns with broader anti-ESG policies. Nothing new, something we definitely saw in the first administration, and right on target here is withdrawing from the US Paris Agreement and pressuring financial institutions to step back from climate commitments altogether. So while those disclosure requirements may be weakened, investors in international markets are definitely still demanding transparency. So even though this is true, and this sort of centers around rolling back certain important regulations on carbon disclosure, should expect to see that going forward. And this one gets a little bit into the weeds here, but I do think it's worth noting, less often talked about in the news. There are some key developments around EPA data and emissions factors. NIH has been facing the same thing, lots of folks trying to download data before it's wiped completely. But the main piece here is the disbanding of the social cost of carbon group. In January, Trump's Unleashing American Energy Order disbanded the interagency working group on the social cost of carbon. And eliminated federal funding, federal estimates for carbon-related economic damages. So this is a really important way for companies to disclose the economic valuation of the carbon that they're emitting. So by operating Business as usual, we need to understand the cost of that associated. So it's really important foundational work for carbon accounting. Um, the EPA's endangerment finding is under review. The EPA is reassessing its 2009 endangerment finding, which underpins greenhouse gas regulations, and revoking it could weaken emissions rules for power plants, vehicles, and industry. And then regulatory uncertainty and litigation risks. These moves introduce uncertainty in corporate carbon accounting that could lead to legal challenges and also delay clarity, which makes it really difficult for companies to know how to prepare, budget, resource appropriately so that they can disclose accurately and avoid issues with compliance. So some data gaps we're looking at, shifting regulatory landscape that complicates compliance, and then state and third-party data sources, private data sources, may become more critical. So that's sort of the doom and gloom, the bad news component of this. Let's get into the segment here where we talk about how we try to address this. So why sustainability is still critical? This I just want to touch on really briefly because I think this is probably what you've been hearing from us, from Kerry, from others for years and years at this point, is that key regulations around the world definitely remain in focus, and the focus is on carbon disclosure and emissions reductions and sustainability strategies. So there's a 155% increase in global sustainability regulations over the last decade alone. Most notably on here is CSRD and California SB 253 and 261 that relate to companies that certainly we work with directly, all require scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions disclosures. And so if we take to the next slide, you can see consistency in the disclosure requirements here. We're seeing more state level disclosure requirements that mirror the California accountability standards. So climate risks and hard emissions data are definitely still a priority. They're foundational to understanding your own operations, but they are certainly a regulatory compliance issue as well. One of the ways that we know that that's going to continue to be a priority is that nearly half of Fortune 500 companies now require suppliers to meet ESG criteria. So there's a sort of a trickle-down effect of having set climate targets from understanding your own carbon emissions, which means that businesses that fail to track emissions risk losing key contracts. And when we have requirements at this level, we're seeing more and more of the suppliers to the Fortune 500 that are now obligated to report and reduce emissions to support efforts towards emissions reduction targets. Massive companies like Microsoft, Walmart that require all of their suppliers to report and disclose their emissions and then also reduce. And then lastly is a really healthy commitment from CEOs to stick with their climate targets. So even as those federal policies shift, the private sector and state level regulations continue to push sustainability forward. We know that we're facing increasing disclosure requirements and pending deadlines on emissions reductions goals, but with fewer federal resources this time. So this is really why we want to bring in the experts, because that poses a tall order for anyone involved. I'm sure everyone on this call is sort of keen to learn how are we going to begin to address this. And so I think that may be the fastest I've ever ticked through those slides. So thanks for bearing with us. But yeah, I want to move us over to a fireside chat here with Kerry. And so I guess I'll start, maybe Kerry, is there anything else you want to say to just introduce yourself briefly? I hope we did you justice, but anything else you want to add?
I'm certainly Googleable, but Corinne, thank you for having me today. I guess by way of introduction, obviously I'm founder and the managing partner for Energy Security Partners, which is work I've been doing for the last 8 years after being invited to leave the White House, where I worked for President Biden when he was a VP. But in addition to that, I do wear several other hats, which you kind of noted. So I have a variety of perspectives that I take a look at, problem sets through. Three of those are corporate board seats, one public, two private. I am a policy advisor, a political appointee to the governor of Michigan on her Council on Climate Solutions. But and you mentioned faculty at University of Michigan. I'm just bringing that up to say, I think what I really love about what I've learned about green spaces is that you're bringing folks together to break through these different silos that occupy our lives and that we kind of exist in. And I think it's really, really important. So I'm pleased to be here. And I too am a silo buster. So just really, really grateful. Hopefully I can share some wisdom from my time in DC or my time in Detroit or my time traveling around the world. Because you guys are all surely a little bit stressed right now. So I'm just happy to be here with you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Kerry. Okay, let's dive right in. So I have a couple of questions here that I want to get through, but then please, if you have questions as a participant here, please pop them in the chat. And I'll make sure that we get that open and can turn to those a little bit later on. Okay, so Kerry, you served as a climate advisor to President Biden and played a really pivotal role at the White House during that time. Can you just share a little bit about how that experience shaped your understanding of federal climate policy, and how does that perspective guide your advice now to companies who are facing these rollbacks under the Trump administration?
Certainly. And I think this may sound unusual for somebody who was a White House policy advisor, but my road into that role was very much place-based. And so that's something I'm going to come back to at our fireside chat. I was on President Obama's Detroit task force. Detroit is home for me. I care a lot about it. I was sent there to literally turn the streetlights back on. And at the time, I was at the U.S. Department of Energy's Clean Energy Office. So I want you to picture this, a time before anyone on this call knew what an LED bulb was. There was a time, it wasn't that long ago. So my job back in Washington was to drive down the cost curve on that advanced technology whilst deploying it in a highly distressed city that was on its way into the largest municipal bankruptcy in the country. We did it ahead of schedule, under budget. It became a darling story, definitely a source of pride for me being a Detroiter. And it was that work that got me noticed by VP Biden. In other words, doing the thing, not just writing gorgeous policy memos about the thing, but actually getting into the weeds and wrestling, which many of you are doing on a day-to-day basis. I think it's really important for people who are doing policy advice to have that lived experience of just how hard it is and the types of partnerships you have to have in place to make really robust policy recommendations. I joke around a lot saying DC does not have a monopoly on all the good ideas. And I still believe that's very, very true. And I think there's plenty of opportunity now for additional subnational leadership. I'm going to wave the Michigan flag at all of you. I live in a climate leader state. I'm very proud of that. We're in the top 5 now. And there's global opportunities. So, another big takeaway is I was just thinking about this, Corinne, before today, like the 3 R's I want to leave you with: resilience, risk, and right. And what I mean by that is the resilience, the place-based work I did here is in fact how I approach my work now. It's how I approach my work working for the VP Biden back then. We were traveling all over, and the one question he would ask me when we go to Youngstown, Ohio, what's the story with Youngstown? What's going on there? And you guys might want to think about that in terms of your customers and their experience and your supply chains and their experience in the places where they live. Risk is the other thing I think about. What's the risk of making the wrong decision? Well, it's pretty steep in this uncertain footing that we find ourselves in. So what we spend time on in our shop, if you look at our website, is doing red teaming exercises, which we can unpack. And then right, staying on the correct side of history. So I say that's a lot right now. Take the long view. And I think you mentioned this a little bit in your slides. You have to take the long view because it is a global game we're in with global players, and you want to be on the right side of history no matter what happens in these next couple of years. So there's my long-winded answer for my approach to policy. It's really just coming at it through the lived experience and the variety of stakeholders it takes to actually win the win.
Excellent. No, I think it's extremely sound advice to think about, how this is affecting your customers as a key driver of understanding this picture. So that's really helpful. And an early hearing for me on the Hill was around LED light regulations. So that is a blast from the past and nice to hear.
If I'm thinking about the right hearing, there was a funny moment in it.
Yes, you.
Yeah, okay.
That's funny.
I was sitting behind the person testifying. That was my job at the time.
That's very funny. I was probably only a few rows behind you. So, okay. So I want to come back to red teaming maybe at a later date. We've seen the administration withdraw from Paris climate agreements again. We've seen them roll back the IRA, which was expected, and loosen emission standards. Which of these reversals or any other component, maybe there's something sort of outside the box that we're not thinking of right now, pose the most immediate risk or opportunity to businesses who are trying to meet net zero or science-based targets specifically?
Well, certainly the IRA freeze is troubling, to say the least. The idea, of course, was to give the kinds of incentives to unlock new markets and projects in both red and blue places in this country. So I think, just even in our own portfolio of clients that we work with, that is deeply troubling to not have certainty. Everybody wants certainty. Everybody wants clarity. So to not have that, I find that particularly troubling. The good news is, again, the subnational and global opportunities. I just did a post this morning on my LinkedIn about our governor here in Michigan being in the UAE and signing a new MOU between the state and one of the Emirates. I think we have to consider these types of opportunities, and we need to activate them now. And one of the things I often say is we probably should have started doing this 3 years ago or more. So not that we all need more work to do, but I think we need to approach things with more creativity. The Paris withdrawal, I mean, we all saw that coming. There's a funny meme right now on social media that's something like, this is so unprecedented again. So we've seen the same sort of response as last time, with America's all in and with corporate pledges to stay in. And I think, like I said, take the long view, and we can talk about it, what that actually means inside your companies in terms of building your own resilience to get through. But it's just because the federal government may be closing the shop, there's still, states and cities and leaders, both in the US and outside the US, particularly in emerging markets. I will flag that for you as something I always think about, probably because I was sent into Detroit when things were really bad to fix things. And what that presents is a slingshot opportunity. I used to call it leapfrogging. So like half the streetlights were off in the city. It was a very dangerous place at night. We went from the worst case scenario to world class. It was the second largest streetlight conversion in the country after Los Angeles, ahead of schedule and under budget. So I'm trying to give you some positivity, but it takes creativity to get it done and partnership during this time. And I think we can learn from what worked last time.
Excellent. Yeah, there certainly are a lot of lessons to be learned from last time. I wonder maybe we can talk a little bit more detail about some of those alliances, a collection of mayors who stood out on climate action first time around here. But I want to turn to one registrant question here who asked about the building sector and pointing to tariffs on steel and aluminum and reduced federal support for on-site solar and retrofits. So if architects and real estate developers or facilities managers rely on these programs, what strategies can they use to stay on track despite not having that access to federal funding?
Yeah, this is where you get creative. I'll also give you another example of a really bad moment in time that some of you all might remember. When the Silicon Valley Bank collapse happened, my phone was ringing off the hook from portfolio companies of ours, and that's not the day you want to get to know your member of Congress. That's not the day you want to realize you have no relationship with somebody you might need. So part of what I teach, you guys are going to laugh at this, but part of what I teach are soft skills. As you can probably tell, I once worked in an Irish pub, so I have soft skills. But I think it's really important that you start looking around you. I'm pretty sure my managing director is on right now, and one of the things he says as a former Marine is, no one's coming to save you. You have to save ourselves. And I know two of your board members really well who have seen me do this in practice, which is assemble the people in your place in the world, in your place, maybe where you're headquartered, your company is headquartered, and figure out who you don't know that you should know to craft partnerships. Here's a very specific example. One of the boards I sit on has a really neat opportunity. I'll just tell you the board because you can look it up. It's just a fascinating company. It's called Blue Green Water Tech. I'm right now looking to make introductions with a variety of global NGOs and a variety of large corporations, because there is a relationship there that can move the ball forward that isn't reliant on federal resources. There are plenty of other financial opportunities that you can take advantage of now. One that's hyper underutilized, particularly in where I live, is called PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy Financing, or things like municipal bonds. So the bad news is you've got to do things differently, and static thinking is not going to move you forward. The good news is it's within reach, and guess what? There are a lot of young and hungry people that want to solve big problems, and they're going to help you find these resources. So I will give you another example. When I moved back to Michigan 8 years ago, I started going to the conferences and seeing who's around, and I would run into the chief sustainability officer of one of our major headquartered companies. And then I'd run into the chief sustainability officer of another one of our major headquartered companies here in Michigan. And I realized they didn't know each other. And that blew my mind. And so I don't particularly sit around waiting for permission. I just started the table. We now have something called the Michigan Business Sustainability Roundtable, where we convene about every 6 weeks under Chatham House rule to talk about our problem sets and our shared opportunities to go after big challenges. So if those tables don't exist where you are, that may be something you consider taking advantage of, because it's a way to daylight things like PACE financing, or maybe you go after a PPA together with a municipality, but you're not going to do that sitting in your silo of excellence. Sorry, I am so long-winded, Corinne. This is what you signed up for.
No, I appreciate you being so, and I'm sure everyone on the line here would agree with me in emoji form or otherwise. But truly, I mean, I think you bring up a really good point. I say this all the time too in our work, which is that it's a really human engagement. Say what you will about Trump, but like one thing I can say is it's a good reminder that this policy is not text written in a book, put on a shelf somewhere, right? This is a really human experience. And we're seeing that have really taken the country by storm. So like addressing the human engagement component of how do we get work done? Who do we partner with? How do we meet them? What creative ideas can we have? Does happen in person in a room. And so I think it's really wise of you to point that out. I think it's easy to forget that when you're talking about environmental policy and things start to get dry.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so even with federal oversight receding, states like California and New York are ramping up their climate regulations. California's SB 253 and 261 and city-led building codes. How should companies leverage these subnational policies or handle data accuracy for carbon accounting when federal agencies might not be updating emissions factors?
Yeah. Those are great questions. I think paying attention to the climate leader states, and I just have to amend and say we are one over here in Michigan too. We're not flyover territory. It's relational at the best. I mean, certainly you're going to want to have your government relations team, or if it's too early for that, you're going to need to reach in and grab a policy grad student from your local university to help you understand, or you can hire my firm and we'll give you the regulatory roadmap. You have to have some policy 101, and it is a little bit more complicated at the subnational level because it's just a lot more work. So just let's be honest about that. But I kind of think in Excel spreadsheets. So mapping it out literally for your opportunities is something that somebody in your shop or outsource needs to get done. Still, like I said at the top of the hour, I still think you play the long game and you continue using the tools at your disposal, like Corinne has already brought up. Because just because I think about this, just because climate is like canceled doesn't mean like the problem sets have gone away. It's just got a little bit more complicated, and I think you have to focus on the long view. The other thing I would say is, nothing replaces being in a place. So if you intend to deploy in California, which is, very high bar of entry, you need to have a footprint there and legitimacy. And so thinking about NGOs, universities, community colleges, where you can have partnerships and something we call TPV for shorthand, third-party validators, is going to be really, really important. One of the things we've found useful in our shop is creating advisory boards to help support companies understanding. So then it's not if you can't afford a full-time government relations person, there's a way to do things. So again, getting creative. and you're just going to have to stay committed to your reporting. I do this a lot with our portfolio that are looking at different states and try to do this stakeholder mapping. That's a big feature of what we do at ESP, to understand. And I use a totally arbitrary number, Corinne. And the number 8 is my magical number. I always say to our customers, like, who are the 8 people that are going to make or break your company, your success in this place, in this market? And sometimes people don't know how to answer that question. So I think like that's your homework assignment from today from Professor Duggan. Figure out who the 8 people are that you need to have your company's name, your project work at the tip of their tongues. You'll have more success if more people know about you. In political world, we call that name ID. Of course, you guys call it brand awareness. But that's going to be really important. So be in the place, start to understand the resources, and stay committed to what you're doing on reporting.
Extremely sound. Another registrant here asked about nature finance, so investing in biodiversity, carbon sinks, regenerative projects, things like that. So again, with the US stepping back from the Paris Agreement, do you see private and state level support stepping in to maintain progress on nature-based solutions?
Yep. I think about, so this is the example of blue-green water tech that I'm living right now. So if you guys are familiar with toxic or harmful algal blooms, HABs, that's the targeted problem that blue-green water tech is solving, but conveniently there's some co-benefits like carbon sequestration and methane abatement. So those are pretty nice co-benefits, and I would encourage you to be looking for those types of partnerships. So the way these will probably be structured is through robust partnerships between, NGOs and subnational governments, whether they're municipalities or states, corporations. I mean, some of the big corporations still have a CSR budget. So, looking at those types of opportunities. There's a term I always like to use. I think I first heard it, funny enough, from Secretary Chu when I worked at DOE. I think before he was even confirmed, he was using the Wayne Gretzky quote of skating to where the puck is going. If you've heard that one, I live in a hockey town. Well, we're not that great right now, but that I want y'all to think about that. It's the same thing that I'm talking about when I say leapfrog or slingshot into world class. You really want to keep going to where the correct answer is. And what that means is surrounding yourself with potentially atypical partners, which is kind of a specialty of ours at ESP. But yeah, I think that's a pretty obvious play. I guess you'd call it a public-private partnership, the public being the subnational government. But it's hard to get that unless you have those relationships.
Excellent. Yeah, the human connection here again. So without federal mandates, many leaders feel pressure to prove clear ROI on sustainability. And of course, this has always been the case. We need to show clear drivers. Do you see investors pushing even harder for data on return on sustainability investment, ROSI, and looking ahead the next 4 years? And what's your top advice for businesses who are wanting to really stay competitive in that space, despite these changing policies?
I'll be a little repetitive here, Corinne, but like the game is global. So therefore, you need to stay on track with your reporting. I think anything you can do to focus on your focus on the basics in terms of controllable cost, just is very obvious. I just had a conversation with Katie McGinty, who you probably know from Johnson Controls, and she gave me a new acronym which I hadn't heard, which was funny. It was JGB. It's just good business. So talking about bringing down the cost of your operations. I look at that, you guys have already figured out, I kind of think probably not like your average DC political policy person, but I think about it. I look for the opportunity. So the big investors in the climate tech space are trying to sort of break through the technologies they're investing in are intentionally trying to make other things irrelevant. And they're looking to unlock big, highly disruptive efficiencies. I'm trying not to name any specific ones, but I can think of like 2 that we work with that are in the built environment space, like one of your registrants had asked about the built environment space. If you make that investment and you get such a quick return, your investors are going to really love that. And there's probably some good PR on top of it, which is also a tool I've definitely made use of over the last, 20 years of doing this. So yeah, the big fan answer is yes, you should still treat your reporting and keep your expectations high, because you want to be on the right side of history at the end of the day. And the expectation is that we need to be dealing with the intensity of our carbon, and it's a global game. So just reminding folks not to only focus on US opportunities, there are global investors looking at this space.
Yeah, I think you make a really important point about sort of you talk about being a silo buster, like you're doing it again and referencing it being a global problem, but global opportunity,
Yep.
right? Um, we get the question a lot of like, okay, we look at our carbon footprint and how do I prioritize what to do next? And I am extremely annoying at that point and like follow up with the question, which is like, well, what are your priority? Like, what do you need to accomplish in order for this to be a win in the next year? When I was running sustainability at SH Hotels and Resorts, I'm curious if you have other examples kind of like in this vein, because I know that our partners find them really useful. Um, we had a climate commitment, but it was very obvious in year one that in order to sort of appease the powers that be, we needed to demonstrate a clear ROI, an easy win, something that was repeatable. And so waste is not something that typically pops in your carbon footprint, but is a really easy cost saving measure that guests at a hotel certainly want to see that a mission driven sustainable hotel company is addressing. And it saved us a ton of money in year one, like really easy ROI. And so I think, I'm curious for your other examples, but I always try to remind folks of like, do you need an easy win or do you need a long-term commitment that you can stand behind that is going to give you a focal point, North Star to point toward as you're making strategic decisions?
Yep. That is that's like exactly the space that we occupy right now, is in the decision process. So, and I know we said we talk about, so maybe this is a good time to talk about the red teaming exercises we do. And I don't know if
Please,
everyone's
yeah.
familiar with that. We have something about it on our website, but it's structured analysis, sort of like making the decisions in a very tight vacuum. And it comes from the military. So part of my thought leadership for the last couple of years, I've been bemoaning that I'd be sitting in these rooms with these amazing, physicists and engineers and policymakers, and I'm like, where's the military at a time when we need precision in how we deploy at scale climate solutions? And so being frustrated that I wasn't seeing that happen, I actually brought in a military leader from the Marines into my shop. And so this is where I've learned about red teaming. And I mentioned to Corinne, and I'll share it with you all. This same person also has been my coach for like the last 15 years. So I'm not just preaching this, I'm actually a customer of this process. And it was said to me by him, this is a little tongue in cheek, but like wonderful, brilliant people are making bad decisions every day. And so I won't get into the special sauce that Todd runs in these processes, but being a consumer and now seeing where I had blind spots and where I wasn't getting the best intelligence from my, most junior people, for example, it is a solvable problem in your organization. It's a way to remove the bias. Like I'm an executive, so I have ego, right? So got to remove all the biases that come along with where I sit in my shop. So I would just encourage y'all, if you're not familiar with that, it is 100% worth the investment of your time to figure out what is within your control and how to make better decisions going forward. We're all very smart and well-meaning people on this call, but we also make very bad decisions every day. So what you've described is a great example. Do we do thing A or thing B? There's 100 different things we could be doing, but how do you just make that decision, I think is the critical path forward, especially in this environment. That's why I wanted to make sure that I brought it up. Yeah.
I love that anecdote. I'm definitely going to borrow that. I hope you don't mind.
No.
Um, And you touched on this now, and you mentioned it earlier, but the lack of clarity being a big component of risk. And you mentioned risk as part of your three R's and identifying the risk of making the wrong decision. So, yeah, can you share a little bit more about like where you've had maybe examples of addressing that functionally?
Yeah,
What's the process look like?
I'll tell you maybe a story that I'll be very coded about what I say here. Always trying to keep myself out of trouble. Um, so let's call it a big company that has got a great brand, well known, and are charging forward on a project. And it is looking good. Things are coming together. They've got the subnational support they want. The incentives are all aligned. They cut the ribbon. They're ready to go, and only to find out in that 11th hour that the community that they're going to do the thing in doesn't want them. We probably could have figured that out on that couple-year journey, right? If we took a pause to run an analysis to make sure that we were checking our biases, that we had done the community engagement. You can't phone that in, by the way. That's not how it works. So another big part of our practice, in addition to red teaming, is the instruction on how to do community engagement, especially in this new environment. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I'm going to just stick with, if we all do a better job in the places where we show up in the world, explaining what we're doing and the why and the benefits and the co-benefits, I think we're going to have better outcomes altogether. But you had in your first slide, Corinne, something about climate justice. And obviously Justice 40 is now a thing of the past. But that doesn't change how a community feels about things happening to them. And if you were working on a novel technology, imagine LED is a novel technology, you still have to do the real work at the community level. So that's a real example of something that happened. Like I was saying, like you have to check yourself along the way, and it's not that hard to do it if you have people who are thinking critically. So I think in this environment, we got to think. There's no static thinking. The way we did things is not going to be the way we do things. And I just encourage all of you to think about who's missing in your conversations as you're building out your projects. Who's missing in your, who's this going to impact, be it a customer or community for your product? And are they part of the process? I'll tell you, I've got all these funny things to say, but this isn't funny. In Detroit, there's a saying that I learned when I was coming here all the time, which is, if it's not with us, it's not for us. So I want to leave you with that, because I know I've got a very shiny resume, but I like keeping it real when I get a chance to talk to people. This stuff really matters, and it matters, small p politics and the big P politics.
Absolutely. Danielle in the chat shared a question, so I'm going to read this one off, and then I'm going to remind everyone we've only got a little bit of time left. If you have questions for Kerry, please drop them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get to them. So more tactical question here. Do we expect that the investment tax credit opportunities for renewable energy installations will be eliminated?
Well, Corinne, I got out of the prediction business in 2016. But I will say this is going to be very interesting as it plays out, like I said, because a lot of the projects had going to red states and red places. If I could give you an example, so you and I are both hanging around Capitol Hill a couple years ago. I worked as the Director of Legislative, Regulatory, and Urban Affairs at DOE's Office of Energy Efficiency, Renewable Energy. And my phone, it was like playing whack-a-mole with my email and my phone. So this was during the Recovery Act, the first one, 2009. Every member of Congress was calling, where's my money? Where's my money? Where's my money? And then on TV that night, they'd be like, this is waste, fraud, and abuse, so just kind of funny how that all plays out. So that's when I'll be watching closely. And I'm sorry, I can't do predictions.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's reasonable to step away from the predictions at this point. We get asked, the same thing with the SEC. Is that gonna, I think there are safe bets, and I think, you mentioned getting good information from your team. Without having full certainty, I think it's wise to sort of like look at what's available and understand that you should plan for that access to funding not being there. And it's preferred, right? Like to seek private funding that's stable, that isn't pending some sort of regulatory upturn, if possible. And so I think like that goes back to having your data organized and understanding what the ROI will be and working with partners to verify and justify that so you can make the case that, okay, if this is not something we can rely on, what is the other funding that we can?
I've been thinking about this one a lot in the last couple of days about just worst case scenario planning. It's again part of the whole red teaming exercise that Todd leads in our shop. But I just as an anecdote, and I don't know, I guess this audience probably skews more towards it, but usually when I'm in front of the audience, I'm like, have you ever heard of a national lab? Have you ever been to a national lab? And the answer is usually no. What's a national lab? But they are, we have the national parks and then we have the national laboratories, which I'm very fond of, both. But nobody seems to be waking up thinking about the national labs. I do. So I took a group down of leaders, local leaders, down to the closest lab to where I live, which is Argonne National Laboratory. And in the lab, they have a data visualization room where you could literally like dial up the worst case scenario of climate impacts and then pin down to where you live or whatever. And I had a utility executive with me who'd never been to a lab, never seen the data visualization room. But you could actually go pin down to the energy infrastructure that they own, dial up the scenarios, and then he's like, oh, I'm like, yeah. So my advice to everyone is do your worst case scenario planning, because guess what? You're going to come out ahead, no matter what. I do that. I try to do that personally. It's kind of a crazy exercise, but highly recommend it. And I do think you're right to just like assume that you might not have the support at all. And if you get support, gravy, but just gravy.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Um, okay, so speaking of community and local, this question is from Sebastian. Speaking of community and local involvement in sustainability initiatives, do you see citizen science or other volunteer-based programs playing a larger role in the near future?
That's a great question. I guess I haven't thought too much about that. I've been pretty dependent on some of the NGOs that I work with. World Resources Institute, for example, is just a great one. It's very robust. Probably not as accessible to your average person. But I think what you're actually getting at is, the local opportunities. So finding those local NGOs. I came out of environmental NGOs when I was younger in my 20s. And so they definitely exist and they definitely give people something to do, which a lot of people do need to feel like they're doing something right now in response to what's happening. It's also really important, we talked about this earlier, getting to know the community in which you wish to deploy or have work or show up in the world. That's a great way in.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. What is that quote about like vulnerability being the cradle of innovation? Like it's true, when you're down, you you look for a way to fix it. Um, and I think communities and grassroots organizations are extremely important for that.
Yeah.
Obviously in San Francisco, and there's a lot of that happening right now. um, Organizations started by friends fundraising for specific candidates, sure, but I think also using AI to develop news aggregators and helping spread true information as much as possible in the face of disinformation. But certainly, I think that I right now I'm thinking a lot about data, right? That like we're in a space where I can still rely on credible databases, but without that, I am going to have to rely on private and community-based open source databases in order to um, provide better solutions. The funding piece is definitely like a little bit hairier on the community side.
Yeah.
Um, Chloe asks, as a sustainability leader in a smaller division of a much larger company, any advice on keeping momentum in sustainability work on the larger scale throughout the company outside of my division?
That's great. Well, first, take care of yourself. I'm doing a lot of focus on wellness now because this is going to be a long road. So that's thing one. Thing two, it's kind of what we discussed when we talk about decision making and red teaming. If you can lift up opportunities that are a slam dunk, for your leadership, the bigger entity to take advantage of, I would be looking for those, and I would be asking around for ideas, particularly where it, brings down your operational cost. Is there a situation, a public-private partnership that you can assemble that will make the company look really good, do the right thing, and not cost any money? That's what I would say. Keep the momentum going that way. But, you got to get creative. As you can tell, I wasn't like a straightforward policy person in DC. I went and did the thing while I was doing the other thing. And it actually took me getting out of the bubble of DC to get something done. So I was flying back and forth. So I could go and I could sit with the problem, understand the stakeholders, go back to Washington and think about it and ask my team inside of DOE, what tools do we have that could, and what don't we have, and what do I need to go outside and get? I mean, that's how you put a partnership together. It'll be in the book. You can all read about it.
Cindy adds 3 keywords or phrases to convince management to stay the course: value proposition, balance of risks and opportunities, and what's the third?
I'm trying not to give you something snarky because I'm good at that.
I think a little snark is encouraged.
It's about managing your risk management.
Yeah.
You don't even have to say the word climate.
And then David asks similar questions to those here. Kerry, how do you see balancing economic versus policy considerations and arguments today versus just recently, the last few years? Should we focus on the economics versus the aspirational value of a project for environmental and other benefits? How much should the ROI to stakeholders versus aligning with standards or other aspirational commitments be?
I would say to you that we've doubled down on the reporting and the data being important, but Joe Public is not reading your reports. Your customers might read something on your label as part of your branding. I think you should be speaking directly to your customers in the community's pocketbook, because if you didn't pay attention to what just happened, we need to speak to people's pocketbook. This has to be meaningful on a personal level. And until, again, I teach soft skills. I'll have students with these policy memos, they're ready to wag a policy memo in your face. I used to be one of those grad students, by the way, so I'm allowed to make fun of myself. That's not how it gets done. It's not how you get anything done, wagging your current data in my face. For Joe Public and consumers and regular people, we need to be getting to what they care about. And they care about, can I put food on the table, keep my lights on, keep the heat on? People are scared. And so all the other stuff is totally appropriate for these rooms and for reporting. But until we get better at talking to the individual, to the community, and being of the community, I think we can probably keep those things separate.
Yeah, that uncertainty extends to more than just the climate space right now, for sure. Even though that is, ostensibly our most important existential crisis right now, I think the interconnection you talk about, again, silo busting, the interconnection of these things is really what's going to help, making sure that you can link it to the existing business drivers, business objectives, make it a wider story.
I got a funny one for you that you just
please.
me of. So I'm not related to the mayor of Detroit, but we have the same last name. I get asked every week. Surprised that didn't come in on the Q&A. When we did the streetlight conversion, I was like, all right. And I was like back in DC. I was like, so President Obama's team would like to feature you in on the road to Paris. We're building the momentum. If Detroit can do it, then anybody can. And he looks at me and goes, I'm not running for the mayor of Paris. So in other words, I'm glad we did this thing. It's really beneficial. It brought down the operational cost for the city, and it's safe here as a result, and so on. But yeah, people are motivated by different things. Just a good reminder.
Yes, they are. Okay, well, with that, I know that we're at time. Thank you everyone so much for your questions, and thank you, Kerry, so much for participating here. Really, really appreciated talking with you. We'll be sure to share information, share the slides. And if you have questions for us, or you want to do a follow-up or anything like that, please feel free to direct your questions to us by email, hello@greenplaces.com. But thank you again, Kerry, so much.
Thanks for having me. Good to be with you all.
Okay.
Take care.
Be well, everyone. Have a nice one.